Miracles, kind of important for Christianity. You can't open the Gospels without encountering claims about miracles. And I've been interested in this for a long time. In fact, I was interested in the subject of miracles as an undergraduate, and I went to my professors at the Jesuit university where I was studying, and I said, "What is there on miracles?" And they said, well, there's David Hume. How many of you have heard of the Scottish philosopher David Hume? What do you know about him? Good guy or bad guy? That's a funny question, okay? I mean, that was a laugh line, sorry. I want to talk tonight about miracles, and I'm going to engage with David Hume because he's the foremost critic of belief in reported miracles, and his criticism has sort of dominated the landscape to such an extent that not long ago at a conference up in Michigan, there was a conference where they brought in some big-name speakers and then a lot of really interested people who, some of whom had done a good bit of study of their own. And one of the speakers had been talking about divine action and saying some odd-sounding things, and finally somebody came up to the mic and said, what implications would your position have for miracles? And he immediately said, nobody believes in those anymore. The guy said, actually, that's not quite true. Well, then, you need to read Hume. The guy at the microphone said, actually, I have read Hume. Then you need to read him again. Wow. That's some kind of a long shadow for a guy to cast who died in 1776 and still be dominating the minds of the philosophical world here in the 21st century. I like to start these talks with an epigraph. Often I choose a verse of Scripture. I'm going to depart from that tonight because I want you to read something that a dead French scientist said. François Arago, an experimental scientist of the early 19th century, said in one of his elegies for a friend, "Doubt is a proof of modesty. It has seldom harmed the progress of the sciences. I could not say as much for incredulity. Apart from pure mathematics, whoever pronounces the word impossible is wanting in prudence." Or in the immortal words of Inigo Montoya, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." All right. So let's meet the Prince of Skeptics. David Hume, Scottish philosopher born in 1711, died in the year of the American Revolution. He's the author of the most popular and, by any measure, the most influential argument against the credibility of miracle reports. This is one of his philosophical essays published in 1748. You might know it by a different title because later editions got retitled. He's the man whose ideas have completely dominated this landscape. Now, it's really interesting. Hume says that you can't rationally believe in reported miracles. You can believe in them, but that's only because they're brought home to your heart by a continual miracle, he says, that subverts all the principles of your understanding. Talk about a backhanded way of getting in the dagger. But there's been a change of fortunes of Hume's argument, and the person who spearheaded that change of fortunes is an agnostic philosopher of science, John Earman, at the University of Pittsburgh in the History and Philosophy of Science department. Here's something that Earman wrote in a book published in the year 2000. "It is almost universally assumed by Hume's admirers and critics alike that of miracles offers a powerful and original argument against miracles. On the contrary, I contend that Hume's argument is largely derivative, almost wholly without merit where it is original, and worst of all, reveals the impoverishment of his treatment of inductive reasoning." This in a book entitled Hume's Abject Failure. I repeat, this is an agnostic writing. He is not writing out of any apologetic motives. It's almost impossible for me to give you the sense of how much of a dominant hold Hume's ideas had on the minds of philosophers in the 1980s and 90s when I was studying this stuff. And here comes an agnostic and says, smoke and mirrors, folks, it's not there. You can think, if you like, of tonight's talk as a kind of a sermon expounding upon Ehrman's text. And I'm going to try to make 3 key points. I'll skip the poem. But the 3 key points I want to persuade you of sound reasonable to me. I hope that I can persuade you that they are reasonable, but they are all going to cut across the kind of position that Hume maintained, and that was for so long the only thinkable position for philosophers. Number 1, the existence of a stable order of nature does not count as evidence against the existence of miracles. This was Hume's main argument. We just know that dead guys stay dead. So to say that a dead guy didn't stay dead would be to go against what we know. So you can't do that. That would be crazy talk. I want you to be persuaded that this is simply a conceptual error. It's actually a mistake, and you can see why. Second claim, it ought to be possible to change one's mind about miracles. Is that too much to ask? Notice that I titled tonight's talk, How to Think About Miracles. I did not call it What to Think About Miracles. You can ask me in the Q&A if you want to know what I think. This is not about what you should think. It's about how to think. And one of the things is it should be possible for you to change your mind. That seems to me to be a very modest request. As we'll see, Hume does not allow it. Third, the proper way to arrive at a reasonable belief is to examine the evidence in detail. Doesn't that sound like a sensible thing to do? You want to know what's true, you look at the evidence. You want to know what's true and you want to be really sure, you look at the evidence closely. That sounds to me like common sense. But that is not the position that Hume teaches. Let's take these one at a time. First point, the existence of a stable order of nature does not count as evidence against the existence of miracles. First, let's hear what David Hume has to say. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle, from the very nature of the fact, is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. Now, if you take an argument that is as entire as any argument that can possibly be imagined, and you put it up against some other argument from experience in an arm wrestling contest, what's going to happen? Pro tip, the argument that is as great as any that can possibly be imagined is not going to lose. So, from Hume's point of view, the best you could hope for would be that you'd have somebody saying, but a miracle occurred, and somebody else saying, but we've got the most complete possible evidence that they don't occur. Think about that for a minute. How do we know what happens in the natural world? This is not a trick question. This is very, very basic. We look and we see, right? How do we know what happens regularly? Well, we try to put together from what we see the patterns that we call the laws of nature. But Hume is telling us, nope, you can't possibly experience a violation of the laws of nature. And it seems pretty possible to me, but Hume is saying, if you thought you were, you're just being irrational. So, one of Hume's contemporaries picks up on this, and this is, again, a point I wanted to make to you. Hume died in 1776. I'm going to read you from a book that was published in the 1750s. We'll read the third edition, published in the 1760s. Hume is still alive when this guy's writing. Hume's own contemporaries answered him and answered him well. Here's William Adams on Hume's definition. An experienced uniformity in the course of nature hath been always thought necessary to the belief and use of miracles. These are indeed relative ideas. There must be an ordinary, regular course of nature before there can be anything extraordinary. A river must flow before its stream can be interrupted. What is he trying to say? What is he trying to tell us? He's articulating a general principle of evidence. This is the point where I tell some of you there is going to be a tiny little bit of mathematics that's going to show up on the screen. So if you're one of those people who carries around an epinephrine pen just to give yourself that shot, just in case you should happen to see some mathematics. This would be the time to pull that out. Have it ready, okay? Here's the general principle about evidence. If, on the supposition that M were true, like a miracle, it would be inevitable that O also be true, like there's an ordinary course of nature, because the miracle is something that stands in contrast to that. Then O, the fact that there's an ordinary course of nature, cannot be evidence against M. In mathematical terms, close your eyes, those of you who can't handle this, okay? If the probability of O given M equals 1, then the probability of M given O is greater than or equal to the probability of M. Okay, that's gone now. It's off. It's passed. I just lost half of the audience. I'm sorry, Bob. They're not coming back. All right. Let's put that in other terms. Signs in religious contexts are there to show us something, and they can't stand out unless there's a backdrop and order of nature. In religious contexts, miracles are supposed to function as signs. What does that mean? Miracles that function as signs would be impossible unless you could tell that they're taking place. What do you have to be able to see to tell that they're taking place? Something different is happening, not the ordinary course of events. Otherwise, it's not a sign, right? Have you seen the stunning evidence for the existence of God? What? Nothing. Not a persuasive argument. So, if that's the case, then the existence of a stable order of nature cannot be used as an argument against miracles in religious context. That's what you would expect there to be. All of this is maybe too formal. We try to do this in pictures. I have a message I want you to see. It's a very important message. There it is. It's there. It's really there. What did I do wrong? The message is the same color as the background. It's there. Might as well not be, because you can't see it. So if I were God, and I wanted to give you an important message, but I made it absolutely impossible for you to tell what it is because it makes no contrast with the background of the way that I've made the world, how could you tell that I was even trying to communicate something to you? God is somewhat smarter than that. God gives us signs like this. You get the point. Why can you tell what the message is? Because it makes a contrast with the backdrop. How can you tell that a miracle has taken place? Because it's not the kind of thing that always happens in the ordinary course of nature. Natural laws tell us how the universe behaves when it's left to itself. We can finesse that theologically, but the point, I think, is a basic and important one. That's why when we see a miracle, we know nature's not being left to itself. Nicodemus got this point, right? John chapter 3. Rabbi, we know that you are a messenger sent from God. How come? Because no one can work the works that you do unless God is with him. We can't do that. We can't heal the sick with a word. We can't open the eyes of a blind man with a touch. We can't still the storm. Nobody can do what you're doing without the power of God. That's my first point. The fact that there's a stable order of nature isn't evidence against miracles. That, you may alertly notice, does not show us that you must accept every miracle claim somebody proposes to you. Good. You shouldn't. That is not the point of this talk. In fact, I'm going to give you later several definite criteria to use to start filtering through the claims that people make. Second subversive, anti-Humean point. It ought to be possible to change one's mind about miracles. Here, I'm going to quote the philosopher William James, not a particularly religious guy, but I think he nails it with the following statement from his book, The Will to Believe. He says, a rule of thinking which would absolutely prevent me from acknowledging certain kinds of truth, if those kinds of truth were really there, would be an irrational rule. if I'm following a rule that guarantees that if something is true, I won't know it, there's something wrong with my rule. That's just not a good way to think. Well, now surely someone who's been vastly influential in modern philosophy cannot have contradicted something that straightforward, right? So let's actually see what Hume has to say about not changing one's mind. He tells a story about someone who was shown some evidence that was supposed to be evidence for a miracle, and Hume quite approvingly says, "He therefore concluded, like a just reasoner, that such an evidence carried falsehood upon the very face of it, and that a miracle supported by any human testimony was more properly a subject of derision than of argument." Wow. Can I get away with that? Can I just say all the people who disagree with me, I'll deride them, and then maybe they'll go away? Some people seem to operate that way. There is this thing, kind of a new thing called the internet, and it does this to people. Have you ever seen that? People who think that the whole purpose of the internet is to let them exercise their ability to heap abuse on people who disagree with them without ever once engaging in actual argument about the evidence, or even worse, giving the other person a chance to lay out the evidence. The internet, it brings out all the extremes of human nature, doesn't it? Lest you should think that this is just a one-off accidental thing, let me give you another quotation from Hume. "But should this miracle be ascribed to any new system of religion, men in all ages have been so much imposed on by ridiculous stories of that kind that this very circumstance," you're saying this in a religious context, "would be a full proof of a cheat, and sufficient with all men of sense not only to make them reject the fact, but even reject it without farther examination." What? This is bad news. What does that mean? That means you can't look through the telescope. Wow. Galileo, we have bad news. Another one. "As the violations of truth are more common in the testimony concerning religious miracles than in that concerning any other matter of fact, this must diminish very much the authority of the former testimony, and make us form a general resolution never to lend any attention to it with whatever specious pretense it may be covered." Wow, okay, cover your eyes, don't look. There might be evidence there. Form a resolution never to lend any attention to it. Wow. Do you see how radically strong these claims are that he's making about what would be rational? Now, I know some of you are thinking, maybe some of you are skeptical, and you're thinking, yeah, but there it is. Hume's a great philosopher, and you're just some guy, so I'm going to go with a great philosopher. All right, let's do a test case, can we? Let's try out this kind of reasoning regarding something that's not a religious subject at all. Let's try meteorites. Meteors are those brilliant things streaking across the sky. Meteorites make it all the way down to the ground. So let's think about a question. Do meteorites really fall from the sky? Rocks from the sky? Well, you know what? There's a kind of a religious context back of this, because many ancient civilizations have stories about stones that fall from heaven, and in fact, some of them built them into their religious shrines. A religious context. Oh boy. At the height of the age of reason, the late 18th and early 19th centuries, most scientists were absolutely incredulous of such reports. Stones falling from the sky. Right. That's hilarious. Sure, tell me another one. Even though there were scattered reports throughout history of these things, they weren't reported, you see, by 18th and 19th century men of science. They were reported by peasants with no scientific training. And so that testimony was summarily dismissed. Do you remember my opening quotation about incredulity? So I'm going to have to skewer some heroes here. Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, dismissed written affidavits that the stones that had fallen from the sky were still warm when they were discovered. In fact, there's a report that he took one of these written affidavits and he changed it. Pro tip: don't do that. When somebody is giving you testimony, you can disagree. You can say, I think he's crazy, I think he's deluded, I think he's wrong, but don't change what he says. This is bad. There's this little thing called confirmation bias, which is a common human tendency to see only the evidence that favors your current belief and not the evidence against it. You are taking confirmation bias to a whole new level when you rewrite the testimony to make it agree with you. Just stop. Lavoisier, what are you doing? Really sad. Pierre-Simon Laplace once interrupted a presentation about meteorites at the French Academy of Sciences, shouting, "We already know enough such fables!" Wow. So it's just your 1,000-fold experience that tells you that there are no such things. Yep. And now I suppose it's your 1,001-fold experience, right? What can you do with somebody who takes that? In fact, Ernst Chladni, who wrote on meteorites in 1819, tells us that disbelief and scorn among the scientists was so common that many museums had discarded their collections of meteorites for fear of being ridiculed. But it couldn't happen, right? Because scientists are dispassionate. They never allow their preconceived opinions or their emotions to enter into their reasonings. Everybody's like Mr. Spock. Yeah. So that won't survive first contact with the history of science. So what happens to Hume-style incredulity when it's brought into the sciences? I'll tell you what happens. It clogs up the progress of science, and that is why an agnostic philosopher of science is not impressed with David Hume's argument. If this argument worked at all, it would gum up reasoning that we know is legitimate in the sciences. Nothing can do that. Therefore, this is not a good argument. So much for my case for my second point. Point number 3. The proper way to arrive at a reasonable belief is to examine the evidence in detail. When Hume talks about thinking about miracles, sometimes he says, I think, wholly insupportable things like I've just been quoting, but sometimes he makes a promising start. Here's a promising start. Long wall of text. I'm violating every known rule of PowerPoint by putting this much text on a slide, but you're a captive audience, so I can do this. I'm just going to read you this quotation. Tell me as I'm reading it, how do you think the religious people of Hume's time and a generation or two after that responded to this challenge? Here's what he says. When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person who's telling me this should either deceive or be deceived, or, more probable, that the fact which he relates should really have happened. I weigh the one miracle against the other, and according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision, and always reject the greater miracle, the less probable thing. If the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then, and not till then, can he pretend to command my belief or opinion. So there it is. You've got to show me that you've got evidence so good, it's more of a miracle for that evidence to be misleading than it is for the event to have happened. Ha ha ha, good luck with that. What do you think Hume's contemporaries and those who followed in a generation or two immediately after, what do you think they thought about that challenge? What do you think a contemporary pastor would say? I can tell you what some contemporary leaders in the Christian community do say. because I have some experience with this. I have a young friend, student that I discipled for a while he was an undergraduate at Western Michigan, who went with a well-known campus ministry group, which I could name, but I won't, to do beach witnessing over spring break. Sounds like a plan. So my young friend went on that, and he's a friendly, good-looking guy with a nice smile, and he got people to talk with him. Probably got a lot of young ladies to talk with him. And he said, I would get to a certain point, and then we'd hit the wall. I'd start to tell them what I believe, and they'd say, yeah, that's nice, but why should I believe that? I'm glad you like that story, but why should I think it's true? And nobody had ever told him what to say. So he went back to the leaders of the group, and he said to them, I'm getting into these conversations. That part's okay. I'm not afraid to start a conversation, but I'm getting to this point, and they're saying, why should I think that's true? Because I'm telling them about, the resurrection and stuff, and what should I say? And he was told, tell them it's called faith. Wrong answer. And he knew that wasn't going to work. So that's when he came to me, and we began working on actually giving an answer to the people who ask you a reason for the hope that is in you. Sounds like a kind of a biblical thing to do. Here's how Hume's contemporaries and those in the 19th century responded. Challenge accepted. Peter Bain says, exactly. He quotes that whole block of text from Hume. He says, exactly. No statement could be more reasonable. Let's proceed to the comparison. The Christian has to produce testimony to miracle whose falsehood would be a mightier miracle than the miracle attested. And Hume has to weigh miracle against miracle. So what was the next step then? What should Hume have done if this was really what he intended to do? What does his own statement require him to do? Clearly, to take up the miracles, which the Christians allege to be true, set their evidence fully and distinctly forth, and to point out that however plausible that evidence might be, its fallaciousness would be no miracle compared with the miracle affirmed. There we have it. Let's go. Let's do this. Yeah. Let's talk about evidence. This is always the way I feel whenever somebody wants to talk about these issues. Great. Can we talk about evidence? Yeah, your sky daddy loves you. Let's talk about the evidence. Can we talk about the evidence? You don't believe in science either, do you? Can we talk about the evidence? Hello? Evidence? Evidence? Anyone? So, what does Hume actually do? Bain continues. He's pitiless in this. Every reader of Hume's essay knows that he has done nothing of the sort. The nature of the evidence required for the Christian miracles, once fairly stated, they've got to be evidence such that it'd be a greater miracle for it to be false than for the miracle alleged to have occurred. Those miracles are quietly put by him out of court. He doesn't want to talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The trial proceeds by proxy. Hume does not ask what proof is offered that the Christian miracles took place. He calls to the bar certain quote-unquote miracles with which Christianity has nothing to do. Hey, some guys claim to be healed in the temple of Serapis back in Alexandria in Egypt. I bet you don't believe that. No, you're right, I don't. Ha! Hypocrite. You should believe all miracles or none. Really? Could we talk about the evidence? He enters upon their evidence, condemns them as falsities, and then calmly informs the court that the Christian miracles are disproven. And that is, in fact, if you've read part 2 of Hume's famous essay, exactly what he does. Well, there's some tale about a guy whose leg was healed, restored from a stump when he applied holy oil to it. I bet you don't believe that. So if you don't believe that, you shouldn't believe your miracles. Oh, some people at the tomb of the Abbey Paris claimed that they were healed of various diseases. You don't believe them? You shouldn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Wait, what? What? Why? Okay. Now, let's try to let somebody reformulate this. Sometimes you got to let your inner skeptic free. Let him talk, okay? Let's try to reformulate a Hume-style objection in a way that seems more defensible. Here's a plausible form of the objection. It requires more evidence to establish a miraculous claim than it does to establish an ordinary one. If I tell you that I know how to play chess, you're probably going to say, okay. If I say I'm a chess master and a former state champion, you're like, oh, I probably want to see a little bit of evidence about that. If I tell you I'm the world champion, you're, nah. I'm going to have to really amp up the proof if I want to persuade you of those things. Okay, that's fine. But there's a not so plausible form of this, which is something that you'll hear in slogan form on the internet. And that is, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Hand in the air if you've heard somebody say that or seen somebody write that. Yep, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That sounds clever. What does it mean? Seriously. Well, what do you mean by extraordinary evidence? I think this argument, or this meme, this slogan, which goes back to Carl Sagan, should be named in his honor. And so I present to you the Argumentum Sagani from the original presenter for Cosmos. Here's how the Argumentum Sagani goes, as best I've been able to reconstruct it after reading way too many people arguing on the internet. It goes like this. Premise 1, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Premise number 2, the claim that a miracle has occurred is extraordinary. Therefore, first conclusion, any evidence supporting it ought to be extraordinary as well. Premise 4, I'm not sure what I mean by extraordinary. Premise 5, but whatever you come up with, it's not going to work. Therefore, 6, no one is justified in believing any miracle claim. I have a technical talk that I can do where I actually go further in unpacking the layers of this kind of thing. But honestly, I think this is pretty much all you need to know about the Argumentum Sagani. Let's do a scientific test case, though. According to one proposed theory in nuclear physics, spontaneous proton decay happens. But it's just really, really rare. It's so rare that no instances of it have ever been observed. That's pretty rare. That looks almost like it just doesn't ever happen, right? Because it never has. So what do scientists interested in this theory do? They set up sensitive detectors in underground water tanks, and they leave them there for decades in an attempt to see whether it actually takes place. Well, that would be an extraordinary claim. The fact that 100% of the protons so far observed have not decayed does not mean that it's impossible for us to accept evidence of such decay. We even try to set up and look for it. Look, what we're asking for here is not some kind of special religious exemption clause from reasoning. We're just asking that there be no double standards. If we're allowed to look for evidence of unprecedented things in physical science, why shouldn't we be allowed to look for evidence of unprecedented things in a religious context? You say, wait, but Hume covered that. He already got that. He told you it's because it's religious and people make false miracle claims in religious contexts way more often than in any other. I agree. They do. And that's a reason to be cautious. Who wants to be a sucker? Does anybody want to be taken in? No. But if there really were a God who really did want to communicate something to mankind and to seal that in a way we could not mistake as coming from just a clever philosopher or an inspired poet, then isn't that exactly where you would expect a miracle to take place? So, if there isn't a God, you would expect that there would be miracle claims in religious context. But if there is one, that would be the very place where he'd be most likely to work it. So that one pulls both directions. It's not a slam dunk. Let me quote somebody from 1729, writing while Hume is still a teenager, about the question of evidence, how much evidence we should look for. I do allow, says Thomas Sherlock, that this case, the case of reported miracles, and others of like nature, require more evidence to give them credit than ordinary cases do. You may therefore require more evidence in these than in other cases, but it is absurd to say that such cases admit no evidence when the things in question are quite manifestly objects of sense? Do you think that you are competent with your functioning senses to tell the difference between a dead man and a living one? No, let me rephrase that. How many of you had a best friend in high school? Somebody you hung out with a fair amount. Okay? You remember that person? Think of some time when you spent maybe the better part of a day with that person. Can you think of that? Got something in mind? Now, if I put you on the witness stand and I said, I'm going to ask you two questions. I need you to answer honestly, and if you're not sure, then you need to just say, I'm sorry, I'm not sure. First question, are you really sure that was your friend and not somebody who just looked kind of like your friend? Are you sure? People make mistakes about identifying people sometimes, you know. I'm not shaking anybody, am I? This isn't working. Okay, second thing, can you swear before the court, under oath, that during that time your friend was alive and not dead? Okay, you're competent to tell the difference between a dead person and a living one when it's your own close friend. You are competent to give the kind of testimony that we have to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's not rocket science. It doesn't require a biology degree. This is it. Okay, but you Christians, sorry, we have another way to stop all this, and that is just there's so many religious claims out there. Where to start? There are many religions, thousands upon thousands of miracle claims. I bet you want us to start with your miracle claims, right? You know what? It's true. There are many religions. There are thousands upon thousands of miracle claims. So here's then the question. How could anyone hope to use miracles as evidence for a religion? You'd have to sort through them all, and you don't have time for that. Gotcha. We're stopping you now, right? Well, what if we said we can meet that objection? How do you meet it? How do you meet the objection that there are thousands and thousands of miracles and we don't know where to start? Here's how. There are neutral criteria that make no reference to any particular religious creed, criteria that can be seen to be reasonable without any appeal to one religion or another, or no religion, that can help us to filter out unpromising candidates for a religious miracle. Where would you come up with those? In an old book by a dead guy, which I have online if you want to go to historicalapologetics.org. John Douglas, a bishop of Salisbury, Anglican bishop, in his book The Criterion, published while Hume was alive. Remember, Hume dies in 1776. This is 1757. Okay? Says a miracle claim may reasonably be doubted when, number one, it is reported only long after the miracle is supposed to have happened. Then you may reasonably doubt it. You may reasonably doubt a miracle claim when it is reported only at a great distance from the scene. If I tell you that last night at the top of Mount Everest, a Sherpa guide turned water into wine, yeah, probably none of us are going to make the trek over to find out whether that's true. Or third, if it would have been allowed when first made to pass without examination. Let's look at these criteria, each one, and see how they might affect some miracle reports. First criterion, when the first report comes long after the event, there is a tale of a pagan sage, which Bart Ehrman likes to quote, and he should know better, and somebody should just call his bluff on this, but I have yet to see anybody really come down on him like a ton of bricks on this. Philostratus wrote a life of Apollonius of Tyana over a century after the death of Apollonius. Douglas's first criterion says, I'm sorry, if the miracle reports come first over a century after his death, that is a reason to doubt. It is not a proof that they didn't happen. That's not the claim. The claim is there's a reasonable ground for doubting that they took place if your first report is long after the alleged miracle. The lives of Pythagoras, the philosopher and mathematician, were written 8 centuries after his time. Most of the miracle claims from the ecclesiastical writings of the Middle Ages, St. Genevieve walking and having flowers spring up in her footsteps as she passes, come only later, not immediately, not while she's alive, not immediately after her death, and they grow in the telling. How about the second criterion, the criterion of distance? When the first report of a miracle is made only at a great distance, most of the miracles attributed to Apollonius of Tyana by Philostratus fall into that camp. There's also a bunch of other problems with those miracle claims. But you can cut the skeptic's favorite example out by two criteria. Third criterion, when the miracle claim would be allowed to pass without critical examination because it supports or affirms established opinions and prejudices. Again, virtually all of the miracle claims of the Middle Ages were advanced to support the existing religious structure. The healings that are attributed to the Emperor Vespasian in Alexandria. Vespasian was just announcing his aspirations to the imperial throne, which he did in fact gain. Alexandria had the temple of Serapis, and the worship of Serapis was being severely challenged by this growing movement of crazy people who got called Christians. The priests of Serapis needed a miracle to bolster their god. Vespasian needed a miracle to bolster his claim to the imperial throne. It was a marriage made in heaven. It would have been allowed to pass without critical examination because it supported and affirmed established opinions and prejudices. Same thing with Hume's other example, the restoration of a man's leg in Saragossa by the application of holy oil to show that the Catholic faith is the true faith. There's a wonderful comment by one of Hume's contemporaries. I'll go back to Adams here. There is a wide difference betwixt establishing false miracles by the help of a false religion and establishing a false religion by the help of false miracles. Nothing is more easy than the former of these, or more difficult than the latter. Here, let me give you an example. Suppose I give you a choice. Here, suppose, for the sake of argument, that you were unscrupulous and you wanted to try to start a religious cult. It's been done, right? L. Ron Hubbard, anybody? It's been tried. So I'll give you a plane ticket somewhere where you can go and try to start your new religion. This is going to be a new religion. It's going to be exclusive. You're going to say, I'm right, everybody else is wrong, and you got to try to persuade people that you're right. Where do you want to go? I'll give you a ticket to Milwaukee, or, your choice, a ticket to Mecca. Where do you want to try to start a brand new religion? Newsflash, try that in Mecca, you'll be dead before you hit baggage claim. Okay? Not promising to do it somewhere where the established prejudices are against you and where they have power. People in Milwaukee might not like what you say, but they're not going to crucify you. Oh, wait, where did Christianity get started? Where does even the Roman historian Tacitus say it originated? Jerusalem, where the founder was crucified. Right there, in the face of the people who had the motivation to deny this, they proclaimed in the streets, this Jesus whom you crucified is risen. It's a wonderful study to look at the actual evidence for the resurrection, and fortunately, we have somebody coming in who's a little bit of an expert on that, who's going to talk about this on a subsequent evening. But I'm not here to tell you what to think about miracles, only how. And so I'll leave you with words of wisdom from one of my favorite philosophers. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. Thank you. Did I leave a little time for Q&A, Bob?
So let's have some Q&A. We've got several minutes.
Questions about old books especially welcomed.
would you say to a skeptic who would look at you and say, by saying that a miracle could happen, you're just simply plugging a God into the gap of our knowledge?
Yeah, so here's a wonderful slogan, God of the gaps. In other languages, it doesn't work so well because it's not alliterated, right? But when you get the two hard G's in there, then that sounds really spiffy. I would say, doesn't it depend on the evidence? If I come home and I find my front door is swinging ajar, I walk into the house and I look around and I notice that the computer is no longer on my desk. I go into my bedroom, I find that all the drawers have all their contents spilled out and on the floor. All of my electronics are missing. I phone the police. The police, in the fullness of time, send around an inspector who looks around and says, okay, well, that's pretty interesting. And I'm like, okay, what are you guys going to do about it? What do you mean, what are we going to do about it? Well, there's been a burglary here. Now, let's not jump to a burglar of the gaps explanation, right? I mean, you look at this evidence, and just because you can't think of any other explanation, you attribute it to a burglar. Whoa. This detective is in somebody's pay. Okay, nobody would accept that as an answer. So, could we talk about the evidence? It all goes back to the evidence, right? I am not saying barely, I don't know how this happened, so I'll say Jesus Christ. I'm saying, look, there's specific evidence for specific things. You may not like it, you may think that the evidence is ultimately not strong enough, but can we talk about the actual evidence? And to brush it aside with a slogan and say, that's just the God of the gaps, is to impose a kind of restriction on reasoning in these contexts that we would not accept in any other area of inquiry. No double standards. Let reason be kept to. It's fine. We have nothing to fear from that.
Concerning Ehrman, I believe you pronounce his name as, or Ehrman?
Yeah.
And Hume's abject failure. Did Ehrman, as an agnostic, propose his own theory concerning rejecting miracles, or was his primary matter rejecting Hume's?
Right, good question, and let's just get it right. It's Bart Ehrman and John Ehrman, spelled a little differently, very different people, and I would love to see them debate. Wow, that would be epic. John Ehrman, who is agnostic, says, I don't believe that these miracles occurred, but that's because I am cynical. The difference between me and David Hume, he says, is that I refuse to elevate my cynicism to the level of a methodological principle. He's cynical. He thinks that probably somewhere along there, somehow, something went wrong. But he's not willing to say, no one could ever rationally believe this upon testimonial evidence. That just won't fly. That's as far as he goes in the examination of that. He says, I have really no interest in gods. If I had any need of gods, they would be the gods of the Greeks and the Romans. But I'm not saying this out of any apologetics interest. I am simply trying to set the record straight. There has been too much genuflection at the altar of David Hume. People don't like this guy. He's really dumping on their hero, and that's kind of a harsh thing to say, but there it is. That's what he has to say. Great question.
So not being one of much study in philosophy yet in my life, I've just been trying to pass art appreciation, so I'm not quite there yet. But
it's all good.
Why is Hume's so overwhelmingly taken as just the authority on this subject in philosophy by, I guess, everybody in that department of thought for such a long time?
Yeah, let me give you two answers. One of them is that Hume writes very well. For his time, he was a very fine stylist, and people who were specialists in rhetoric, like George Campbell, pointed that out. Even though Campbell disagreed with all of Hume's conclusions about religion, he said this man's really a very fine rhetorician. So let me quote David Hume about David Hume. He didn't think he was talking about himself, but he was saying something true and applicable. He says, eloquence, when raised to its highest pitch, subverts all the principles of the understanding. And that happens. If you know someone who is persuasive, someone who has that way with words, the voice of Saruman, it's hard to resist, right? What does Tolkien say about Saruman's voice? It seems so wise and reasonable that it made people want by swift agreement to seem wise and reasonable themselves. Thank you. I see a Tolkien fan out here. We love you. Okay. That happens. That really happens with real people. The other thing is that Hume is saying things that some people very much want to hear. And it's hard to listen to someone saying things you want to hear and saying them eloquently and not let yourself just get swept away. That's very, very difficult. I struggled with this when I was a student. Kind of an odd thing to say, but I was aware that I write well. I can write persuasively, and I really wrestled with this question: should I write persuasively, or will that just make people believe what I'm saying because I'm writing well? It takes a while to come to a point of balance there where we say, truth deserves the best we can give it. And then you have to do your diligence. I've spent thousands of hours trying to read the best that can be thought and said against what I believe. I search these people out. I probably read more of Strauss's Life of Jesus than it would be good for anyone to read again. But if you want to be sure that you're not fooling yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool because you want to be fooled that way, then you do have to take some steps. But we shouldn't let that fact paralyze us, right? It's one thing to be cautious, and it's a different thing to be paralyzed. To be cautious, to say, I don't want lightly to believe something that I very much wish to be true, that's fine. To say, since I must be biased, I just can't possibly come to a conclusion about this. Now that's paralysis. There we've moved from the rational to the irrational. But those are the two reasons, I think, why Hume has exerted such dominance on philosophic thought. He writes well, and he's telling people what they want to hear. They want a silver bullet. They want some way to just push all this superstitious nonsense out of the way. Just forget about that stuff. Can I just get rid of that stuff and not have to pay any more attention to it? It makes you feel enlightened, and there is no drug like the feeling of self-enlightenment.
Is there any chance we could get the math back on the screen for a little while? You moved the slide before I could write it down.
Mary, I love you. Yeah.
Hey, Tim, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. A question about, this is not a trick question, but a question about evidence. Whether it's a good thing or bad thing, several years ago I began to read phenomenology, Husserl and Merleau-Ponty and that whole world. And it seems like when they use the word evidence, they're really open to evidence in interesting ways, where I wonder if contemporary skeptics, when they use the word evidence, is the bar higher or something? When someone says evidence, they're really wanting something. I'm just curious, in your study going back 17, 8, has the term and concept of evidence changed over the years? Or I'm curious about how evidence has been used in the history of thought.
Wow. Small question. Right. So I have an article on evidence in the Rutledge Companion to Epistemology that I will send to you. That would be one place to go, but it's not really a historical survey. When you say, when contemporary skeptics speak about, I sort of start pinwheeling and saying, well, some of them probably to some extent mean this, and some of them probably aren't thinking very much, and some of it is just scientific chest thumping and saying, science, 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 go away, you religious nutcase. But I think what is at least a common strand in a lot of contemporary denunciations of faith as not being based on evidence is a kind of second-drawer logical positivism, leftover appeal to only what my senses can verify, in some narrow sense of verify. And that really restricts our ability to know things about even the scientific laws in the physical world. It's an epistemology that was killed by logical positivists. People like Hempel and Feigl came along and they killed off their own brainchild. It morphed into logical empiricism and they went in other directions. But I think that kind of very simplistic epistemology does underlie at least a large number of contemporary, profound-sounding, authoritative pronouncements about evidence. And I agree with you, and I would just add, reading some of the older writers can give you a wonderfully broadened sense of what counts as evidence. Really counts. Not in some wishy-washy, it favors my view, so I'll call it that. Not a warm, fuzzy feeling. Real evidence, just a broader conception of what that can amount to.
I've been trying to come up with a killer argument, which I'd appreciate if you would see if this meets that criteria, where atheists could see, okay, here's a miracle that in your day and time you have seen come true. We look at the creation order of events, where there's, the Big Bang and the light and water and the land, all has been verified. Just in the last century, they have uncovered the Big Bang and all that stuff. So in their lifetime, they've seen that science is safe. This happens. So then you got Moses 3,000 years ago that got all of these creation events in the correct order and named them. So to me, it's a killer argument that it's been in black and white print for 3,000 years, and now in their lifetime, it's not 2,000 years ago with the resurrection, but in their lifetime, they've seen it come true. So to me, it seems like a killer argument. Would you comment?
Yeah, so if I put on my skeptic hat and try to push back against this argument from the order of things that are talked about in the creation story, I'd probably try to go two directions. Number one, and maybe even three directions. Number one, I'd say, that's interesting, but it's not enough to persuade me that Moses was divinely inspired. Maybe he just had a really good day. Number two, there are a lot of different ways to read that ancient Near Eastern stuff. And, one of the ways of reading them also says that it all happened on 6 literal days, and the march of science has shown us that didn't happen. So you can't just take one reading and say that's got to be the right reading. Just trying to put out fog. I note for the record that this is the only time when a skeptic wants to tell you there are multiple ways to read Genesis 1, right? Yeah. Usually they're the ones who are saying, no, there's only one way, and it's one I know is wrong, and here's why. The third thing is, even suppose that we were to grant that, and I think there are some people who are moved by that, and who say, well, it's odd that this is exactly what I would have tried to write in that time, in that place, in a vocabulary they could understand if I were trying to write about the order of events. Still, there are things that doesn't tell you. Is there forgiveness for sins? Does the creator of the universe, who may have happened to create these things in this order, care about you? Was Jesus Christ sent from God? Was he, in fact, God incarnate? That isn't going to tell us. And the mere fact that you've bound together Genesis in a book with 65 other books and called it the Bible doesn't really mean that Matthew's gospel has to have the same level of credibility or authority as Genesis 1. So that would be the third place to drive the wedge. All of that being said, I like the way you think because you're taking concrete facts and you're saying, hey, can we check and see whether these line up? And if they do, can we at least take that for something? Can we at least agree, yeah, these do seem to line up in this way? So I like that way of going about it, and I would really almost classify that as akin to the argument from prophecy.
Yeah, I
Because-
tend to ask them, well, how did Moses do this?
Right, because the argument from prophecy, and there's of course all kinds of strands to this more generally, is itself a kind of argument from miracle, but one that doesn't involve any obvious violation of natural law or the closure of the physical universe. And older writers get that. They say that. They go straight to the fact that the argument from prophecy is an argument that's unfolding even now into our own times. You read Deuteronomy 28, also written by Moses. That was also Moses. And what do you see? It's like a history of the Jewish people. Across time, all those things. And if you do not hold to these commandments, if you do not keep these statutes, what's going to happen to you? Try to think of another ancient people group described by Deuteronomy 28. Try to think of any ancient character whatsoever besides Jesus of Nazareth, described by Isaiah 53. I think the argument from prophecy is neglected. I think we ought to bring it back. I think we ought to talk more about it. I think we ought to talk more about chapters from Ezekiel. I think we could really stand to recover some of the old books. Oh, did I mention I have old books on this subject at historicalapologetics.org? So yes, tolle lege. Thank you.